Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our alcohol policy series, Social Host and Liability Laws. Your webinar host today is the Great Lakes PTTC Network. The Great Lakes ATTC, MHTTC, and PTTC are all funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, otherwise known as SAMHSA. This presentation was prepared for the Great Lakes PTTC under a cooperative agreement from SAMHSA, and all of the views expressed at this time are the opinions of the speakers and not necessarily SAMHSA or DHHS. We are funded under cooperative agreements with these. And a couple housekeeping details. There is no call-in number available. This audio will be broadcast through your computer speakers. Because this is a pre-recorded webinar, the Q&A session will be available to you via Qualtrics survey. There are no CEUs or certificates of attendance. And again, the Q&A session will be for a Qualtrics survey that will be sent to you. Our speakers today are Chuck Klevgaard and Kellie Hendricks. Chuck delivers training and technical assistance to support substance misuse prevention throughout the Midwest. He has supported communities and health agencies as they adopt evidence-based alcohol, opioid, and other substance misuse programs and policies. Chuck also serves as a prevention manager to the Great Lakes Prevention Technology and Transfer Center. He earned his BSW from Minnesota State University Moorhead, and he is a certified senior prevention specialist through the Illinois Certification Board. Welcome, Chuck. Kellie Henrichs. Kellie is the program manager for the Alcohol Policy Resource Center at Prevention First. Kellie brings over 2 decades of successful experience in substance misuse prevention and policy work. She is a subject matter expert in youth prevention, education, communication campaigns, strategic planning, and communication coalitions. Kellie regularly provides training and technical assistance to providers throughout Illinois. Kellie works with communities to reduce underage drinking by analyzing data, identifying contributing factors, implementing policy efforts, and engaging law enforcement. A strong believer that communities have the power to create change, Kellie works to empower key stakeholders, community leaders, and coalitions to work together to address underage drinking. Kellie enjoys spending time with her husband and teenage children when she's not working and experiencing the adventures and misadventures that life has to offer. We appreciate both of you being here. I'm going to turn it over to Chuck now.
All right. Thank you, Ann. I will begin with a quick review of where we started. As you heard a moment ago, this is part of a series that was really kicked off with a broader overview about environmental strategies. So today we're going to spend some time specifically looking at social host liability laws. So at the end of this particular webinar, you'll be able to describe those laws, you'll be able to list the outcomes associated with them, as well as identify best practices for implementation of those policy initiatives. Again, the broader definition, as we've talked about in previous parts of the series, we're really looking at prevention efforts that aim to change or influence community standards, institutions, structures, attitudes that shape individual behavior. We spent time in previous webinars looking at the full continuum or categories of environmental strategies. We've talked about communication, education, and enforcement. Today, we'll talk about policy adoption, again, looking at specifically promoting policies, laws, and regulations as a means to create community change. The basic description of social host liability is looking at laws that impose civil or criminal penalties on individuals, social hosts, for underage drinking events held on property they own, lease, or otherwise control. The objectives of these kinds of policies have to do with decreasing social access to alcohol for underage youth and to deter underage drinking parties directly. We know some of the research tells us with regard to outcomes is that in addition to addressing access, These kinds of policies can reduce alcohol-related traffic fatalities, deal with total motor vehicle deaths for minors, self-reported probability of heavy or episodic drinking and driving, underage drinking in private settings, and again, in relative to comparison communities with social host liabilities have demonstrated reductions in youth drinking in large peer groups. All, again, sort of important outcomes. Populations that have been studied looking at focused on parents and other adults who would in that case be hosts, as well as the impact on youth under the age of 21. Without further ado, I will turn it over to our speaker today, Kellie Henrichs from Prevention First, the Alcohol Policy Resource Center.
Thank you, Chuck. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I am Kellie Henrichs, and I'm looking forward to diving into the challenges and lessons learned regarding social host ordinances at the local level. I want to thank the Great Lakes PTTC along with SAMHSA for hosting this webinar. So I got to tell you, and perhaps I'm just feeling my parental responsibilities a little bit more right now as Illinois implements the statewide shelter-in-place order. We're all spending a tremendous amount of quality family time together. Or, perhaps it's because my twins are dangerously close to turning 16. They've entered high school. We're navigating new events like homecoming, prom, new social circles, and it's all incredibly difficult. And we're going to add to that soon they're going to have their license. I don't even want to talk about dating at this point, but they're going to be far more independent. And I always thought if I could just get my kids through, potty training and being a little bit more independent, life would get easier. But I got to tell you, wow, this parenting thing is really hard work. And young people need to be around other young people. It meets a social need. They need to expand their social circles. They need to expand their social roles and gain independence. That's a healthy part of adolescent growth. But we often forget the responsibility that puts on youth as well as parents, who are oftentimes, we're doing the best that we can do. When it comes to alcohol and underage drinking, many parents simply don't know what they don't know. So as we begin our discussion on social hosting, I hope you'll give parents a little leeway, because unless you work in the field of substance use prevention, treatment, recovery, you may not be aware of the fact that many of the common beliefs about youth and drinking are myths, and parents and community adults may not be aware of a state's social hosting laws or perhaps what local ordinances might exist. Additionally, social hosting ordinance language can be fairly difficult to understand. So recently, I had the chance to look over state social host laws through APIS, and that's the Alcohol Policy Information System. So I looked at the states that are part of the Great Lakes PTTC: Illinois, Wisconsin, Ohio, Minnesota, Michigan, and Indiana. And it very quickly became difficult to keep some of the details straight in terms of which states had different property types that were included in their ordinances, what the knowledge standard was, what the exceptions to the law were. The specificity of the language is downright confusing. So social host laws vary state to state, and there are different elements of social host liability. Having said that, I think it's important to find out what that state social host law is and familiarize yourself with the ins and outs of the law, as well as with any local ordinances that your communities might have. So I'll try to keep our discussion today fairly general, but as always, I really encourage you to check with your state and local laws to see how that's going to directly apply to you and your community. So we saw a definition earlier that Chuck presented, so let's kind of review that and start out by, we're coming from this definition of social host liability laws impose civil and or criminal penalties on individuals, who we then call the social hosts, for underage drinking events held on property that they own, they lease, or they otherwise control. And when we look at social host liability laws, we aren't so much concerned about who provided the alcohol. These laws are focused on the place that was provided for young people to drink. Studies indicate that social host laws are among the most effective and recommended ways to reduce underage drinking. Another benefit of social host ordinances is that they send a powerful message that holding underage drinking parties is not acceptable. And it's not acceptable in the community, and it's going to empower concerned citizens to report suspected underage drinking. And they provide law enforcement with a tool to address parties where alcohol is served to underage youth. Now, most states do have social host laws, but there are gaps in these laws that can be addressed at the local level. And that's why many communities decide to move the route of having that local social host ordinance. So if you have a state law, you can't lessen anything within that law, but at the local level, you can really impose stricter penalties and shore up some of that language. For some communities, a local ordinance is easier to enforce and prosecute. It can allow for greater sanctions that can deter violations. Fines can be established that help emergency services, as well as law enforcement recoup costs that they spend on social hosting response. Local laws, they just may be more sustainable, and with local buy-in, there's a greater likelihood that the policy will be enforced and prosecuted over time. We know that when community members are part of putting together ordinances and a part of that process, typically they buy into that more. There's also the opportunity for increased awareness and changes in community norms that support enforcement. These gaps in state law will lead municipalities to look for more comprehensive efforts to prevent and reduce underage drinking, but also they're looking for efforts that can decrease accidents, property damage, violence, and other consequences of underage drinking in communities. Another challenge, unfortunately, is that while we know the truth when it comes to underage drinking, there's a lot of adults and community members who believe that providing alcohol is a quote-unquote, safer environment, and it prevents youth from drinking and driving, and that's got to be a safer alternative. There may be the belief that if they drink at home, in that home environment, it will teach young people to drink responsibly. You might hear the rumors that kids can drink at a much younger age in Europe, and there's just not as many problems. And I have to tell you, these are fairly reasonable assumptions if you just don't know what the research says. So social hosting laws seem to go against what might make some sense to people. It's important to help provide some context and help our communities by sharing the information we know and by sharing what research tells us. We know that in Europe, young people have higher intoxication rates than in the United States. Also, a greater percentage of young people in a majority of Europe report binge drinking at higher rates than compared to their U.S. counterparts. Often we hear that kids are drinking at high levels because it's this forbidden fruit. But research continues to support that when the forbidden fruit is no longer forbidden, youth simply drink more. And studies show that youth who drink at home are more likely to binge drink outside the home. Starting to drink at an early age is also linked with higher risk of alcohol dependency as an adult. Another challenge can be that when we look at local social host ordinances, we're transitioning our prevention efforts. Traditionally, when we talk about youth and underage drinking prevention, we focus prevention efforts on youth. Where social host efforts, it's just more than talking to youth and helping youth make good decisions. We're changing that target population, and we're focusing on parents and adults and holding them accountable. This is a big change, and it really changes how we're doing some prevention work. Along with transitioning our prevention efforts from youth to adult, we're also turning our focus to social access. And things have changed over the past years, and for a while, a decent amount of prevention efforts were focused solely on retail access and making sure that those who sold alcohol were selling and serving alcohol to only those who were 21 or older. And while we still need to make sure retail access is monitored in our communities through things like alcohol compliance checks, the data overwhelmingly shows we need to be addressing social access as well. Social host ordinances work to deter youth access to alcohol through social sources, such as parents and other adults, and reduce alcohol availability at parties and private events. A local social host ordinance is an effective option to help reduce social access and underage drinking. Something that has certainly changed over time and is problematic to social hosting enforcement is that law enforcement manpower issues are certainly something that we need to take into consideration, but many people, we haven't really thought about that. Obviously, what we might hear about most often is that many law enforcement agencies are facing a crisis in their ability to recruit new officers and retain the ones that they have. Additionally, a growing number of current officers are becoming eligible for retirement. But really, manpower issues go deeper. Younger officers are more focused on a work-life balance, and they're not taking advantage of overtime. Two-income homes often don't require officers to look for all of that overtime to help pay the bills. Many police departments and sheriff's offices report overtime available that's never taken, and that's certainly new. It used to be that overtime was quickly used and however much was available would be used up, and that has changed. Now, how this affects those of us in prevention? Well, honestly, when the police workforce is low, there's a critical prioritization of police time and efforts. And oftentimes, law enforcement strategies that reduce underage drinking are just not top priorities, or maybe they become the focus when there is overtime and somebody takes advantage of that overtime to cover the officer's time to participate in things like alcohol compliance checks, controlled party dispersal, shoulder tap, roadside sobriety checkpoints, and efforts that would address social hosting. We've had communities who acknowledge social hosting is an issue. They've got good, solid ordinances in place, but there simply isn't the law enforcement capacity to do much about it, and this directly affects our efforts. It's an issue we need to be aware of, and simply assuming law enforcement will be on board and able to enforce local ordinances is a critical mistake. We have to be willing to have long conversations and important conversations with law enforcement organizations about what a commitment to social host looks like, what their availability can be, and how you can work on that together. And just not make any assumptions, but make sure you have those conversations and make sure everyone is on the same page. We often talk about the importance of media advocacy after you pass a community ordinance, and while I think this is still important, I would challenge you to think about what benefits you might gain if you also spend the time, energy, and money to invest in media advocacy ahead of the ordinance. And that can help you build awareness and increase knowledge on what a local social host ordinance would address. And consider doing this before you begin moving too quickly ahead with local social host efforts. It can be challenging to slow policy efforts down once they get going. So it's important to have a plan on how you will educate the community about the efforts beforehand. Educating your community can be central in helping build support because you'll help everyone understand what constitutes a social host ordinance, as well as what those financial implications can be, legal implications of an ordinance would be, and it might help you avoid some potential backlash from the general public by providing some education. Social hosting is often misunderstood, and the more that you can do to help your community understand what a social host ordinance is, as well as what it is not, the better you are at paving your way towards success. So I want to turn our focus at this point to lessons learned and ways to help you achieve success with your community work. And just because there are challenges, maybe it's going to make the work a little harder, but one thing that we know is lots of communities have been doing social host ordinance work. And a lot of information is out there to help guide us through this process. There's an important connection between policy work and gathering data and presenting data. Ordinance should be developed based on your specific community needs. We talked about in our last webinar that oftentimes, coalition members, stakeholders will hear about what another community is doing and decide they want to get on board. But we really need to make sure we back up and look at what our data at the community level looks like before moving forward. So you'll want to gather survey data and some anecdotal data from your stakeholders, such as law enforcement, hospitals, your emergency medical providers, other community organizations, and that's going to help you get a clear picture of the alcohol landscape in your community. Using data will help you identify how serious the problem underage drinking is in your community, what is contributing to it, and then you'll have the ability to match up strategies that can reduce the behaviors. Once you have data that establishes social access as an issue in your community, it can be valuable to present some model ordinances to garner support. Additionally, it can be helpful to bring in law enforcement personnel. Perhaps it's a chief or an assistant chief from a neighboring community that successfully navigated a social host ordinance, who's actually written tickets based on social host ordinance, and they're able to help you build support and hear about what this process is like for law enforcement and share with you some successes and challenges as a way to learn more about those nuts and bolts of social host ordinances from that enforcement perspective. Open and honest community conversations about underage drinking are essential to reducing underage drinking and high-risk drinking behaviors. So I've already introduced the need to invest time in engaging your community, and while I don't want to belabor the point, it really is critical to have stakeholder support and support from elected officials. You might be surprised by how different of a process policy work is with the strong support from even one elected official within your community. Once you have that champion, you might find that they're able to reach out to other local officials and get the ball rolling fairly quickly. I'll mention it again in our presentation, but champions can spur our efforts forward quickly, and often those champions are really able to help us navigate the world of politics. And we come in as coalition members and stakeholders, and we come in with as much information as we can, but oftentimes it's just kind of the small details about how municipalities operate and how ordinances are passed, and it's having that champion by your side who can navigate that with you. And that can be critical in the work that you do. I've also mentioned the challenges with understanding your state's social host law, as well as knowing what current language exists at the local level around social hosting. Researching existing policies and language will help you and your coalition identify, are you starting at ground zero and there's no municipal language included on social hosting? Or perhaps there is some language there, but it needs to be rewritten to be more clear or effective. Or perhaps the policy language is actually strong. There's just not a lot of awareness of the ordinance, or enforcement of the ordinance is an issue because law enforcement isn't on board at this point. So typically you can go to your community's website and you'll be able to find the municipal code for review. Oftentimes you'll have to look at the alcohol code and you'll find what information about social hosts your community has within that language. It's also important to look at other communities' social host ordinances. While I like model ordinances and they give a great example of what should be included, I think it's important to craft an ordinance that will work effectively in your community, as communities are often unique, and even those side-by-side communities can be very different when you look at the demographics. I've often found that, looking at different communities and picking the best parts of those ordinances can really lead to putting together a strong policy that will work for communities. So if you can spend a lot of time up front familiarizing yourself with other communities' ordinances and kind of getting to know what that language looks like, you're going to save yourself a lot of time on the back end because you'll know what you feel is really going to work well in your community. Mentioned during the challenges was the importance of media advocacy, both before and after your community efforts to pass a social host ordinance. My lesson learned was that both the efforts before and after are critical to building awareness and support for your ordinance. We want to keep community members informed on local social host ordinance initiatives and invite their support and input along the way. Additionally, we know that laws only work if people know of their existence and they have a realistic expectation that their failure to obey the law is going to be met with consequence. So they know the law's out there, but if nobody's doing anything about it and they don't ever hear anything about it, people are likely to kind of put that to the side and not pay much attention to it. So we want to focus on really taking further steps. And, the first time law enforcement writes a social hosting ticket, doing some media advocacy around that. And that can help solidify in community members' minds that this is real. And law enforcement means business. And when someone violates a social host ordinance, there are consequences to that. Publicizing your new social host ordinance and informing the community about both state and local consequences for violating the law are an important part of the work that we're going to be doing with policy. Reaching out early is an important task too. Building relationships with stakeholders is key to success. And not only is this in reference to your typical policy stakeholders, but also making sure that at that coalition table, local government is represented, that law enforcement is a part of every discussion, emergency service providers, having alcohol prevention and treatment providers, and parents, and of course, youth. And although very controversial, I think you at the coalition level need to decide your comfort with this, but would there be a potential advantage to having a commercial alcohol vendor on your coalition? You'd have to select this person very carefully and make sure that their focus was also on keeping youth safe and healthy. But some coalitions have said that they benefit from having someone within the industry to help. But you have to decide your comfort level with that. It's incredibly important to reach out early to your county or your city attorney to discuss coalition efforts and submit your own ordinance language to work with. You might have to follow a required legislative format and have some appropriate ordinance language guidance that the city attorney or county attorney can help you with, but it's really critical for the coalition to provide input on that language. When you provide input on that language, you're also going to be able to incorporate alcohol policy best practices and really let come forward what are important parts of an ordinance to all of your coalition members and what that can look like. Keeping the theme of reaching out to stakeholders and city attorneys, as mentioned before, it's incredibly important to identify who your champions might be when it comes to alcohol policy. I've had the opportunity to work in many different communities, and if you ever need to reach out and kind of get some guidance, we'd encourage you to give us a call at the Alcohol Policy Resource Center. Jody Hevelin, who is the coordinator of the Alcohol Policy Resource Center, has had a lot of ground level work with alcohol policy, specifically at the social host level. And one thing that she always has talked about is in one community there was just one champion who really was able to take on a tremendous amount of work and advocacy and who really pushed this ordinance through with very little effort because it was the right person at the right time. So really looking around your table and seeing who might be able to be that person who can, rise to the occasion, because those champions really can make life in the policy world a lot easier. So let's take a little bit of time to talk about the impact youth can have when it comes to policy adoption. Youth are affected by social access, and as the population of concern, they should naturally be involved in the solution. Youth can share their insights, they can share their perspective, and they can share their thoughts. And if you have a student advisory board as part of your coalition, or if your school has a SAD chapter or a student prevention council, they can add depth to your discussions with your stakeholders and community members and elected officials. If youth are prepared to educate governing bodies and take on some of that advocacy responsibility, it can be very powerful. People are often much more likely to listen about a youth issue if it's presented by a youth from the youth perspective. You'll want to invest some time to ensure that your youth are educated and that they're comfortable speaking in public. And so that's going to take some time to prepare them and take the time to practice with them. And when they're ready, you'll want to make sure that they're on the agenda to speak at community presentations, city council meetings, county board meetings, any opportunities that arise that can get that youth voice out there. Youth voices matter, and they can be powerful in the work to pass this local social host ordinance. The messaging that goes out about social host ordinances should be coordinated. Everyone should be on the same page with talking points, and this will allow community members to hear the same main points no matter who is presenting and who they're talking with. All coalition members, stakeholders, youth members, elected officials should highlight the purpose of the social ordinance and that efforts are focused on keeping youth safe and healthy. Having talking points will also prevent any speculation on the ordinance, and that it's a ploy to punish parents who are out of town on vacation and then kids have a party at their home, or that the ordinance is going to be used as a gotcha tactic by law enforcement. We want to dispel those myths right up front, and by having some concise talking points that everyone focuses on, you can really prevent that speculation and focus on, we're just here to work on policies that can keep our youth safe and healthy. Additionally, preparing stakeholders, coalition members, and youth to engage with and talk with the media takes some preparation and strategic planning. You want to manage those messages. You'll want your audience to quickly understand the importance of ordinance work and why you're doing it, and this is going to require, creating this short and concise message that quickly provides an overview of the work you're doing. Always remember that less is more with the media. And while we might want to go out there and try to cover 10 points and help them understand the finer details, it's actually better to really have them get a high-level overview and cover 2 points 2 times and have the audience remember just those few points because those are important points for them to remember. Messages have impact when they're repeated over and over again. So spending the time up front to develop and create those very specific messages can be worth its weight in gold in terms of how your community can perceive these new efforts. So I've already discussed with you the importance of informing your community and educating your community members, stakeholders, and youth, but there's a lot more education that's going to be needed when a community adopts a local ordinance to address social hosting. You'll want to take the time to educate landlords and property owners on social hosting and how it can affect their rental properties, as well as working with them to provide some education on their options of what they can put into lease provisions that require compliance with the local or state social host ordinance as a part of a lease obligation. Renters can be held responsible for what happens in their apartment, and this is going to allow landlords to know what that process can look like. We also want to take time to educate our hotel and motel operators and staff. Ordinances can be applied to those who paid for a hotel room. You know, they're in the process, they're responsible for everything that happens in that hotel room, and hotel operators can create stringent party rules. They can put together party contracts and agreements that guests will sign, and then it provides a way to hold guests accountable should they host underage parties. Lastly, social host ordinances don't only have the potential to close some of those loopholes in the state law and strengthen language. Local ordinances can create language for sanctions that allow for law enforcement or for emergency responders to recover response costs and associated costs. It can be expensive to respond to social hosting for both our emergency responders and law enforcement. You have to include that language as part of the local ordinance, but it is a way to recover some of those costs. A couple of last items I'd like to mention, things that come to me last minute that I think are really important points that I want to cover with you before our webinar ends. When developing a local social host ordinance, it's imperative that all terms and definitions are clear, fully defined, and agreed upon. The only way to ensure the ordinance is enforceable and prosecutable is if that language in the ordinance is clear and concise. So some key terms that should be included for a local social ordinance and that are often actually defined specifically in the ordinance language may address things like, what is the knowledge threshold? Is it actual knowledge versus constructive knowledge? Actual knowledge means that a person must have known, as opposed to constructive knowledge where they should have known. Constructive knowledge is notice of a fact that a person is presumed by law to have knowledge regardless of whether he or she actually does, since such knowledge is obtained by the exercise of reasonable care. And within the state of Illinois, we have many communities that have local social hosting laws who use language that specifies that parents would have to know, or community members would have to know that this was happening. But we also do have communities who have very specifically defined constructive knowledge, and that ordinance is based on the fact that you don't have to actually have known, but there's the reasonable assumption that as a parent, if you're out of the house and you leave kids alone overnight, that social hosting is something that could happen. So you just have to have an understanding of which way your community wants to go and tighten that language up and have it very clearly defined. It can also be important to include a definition of premises or property that fully captures where parties can be held. This can be really confusing to parents and community members because there's the assumption, it just assumes that it's the residence and the home that's a part of social hosting ordinances, where we know it's far beyond that. So including language like a boat, farmland, hotels, apartments really will help capture the essence that we're talking about anywhere that a person owns, leases, or has control of. 3 terms that I think should be a part of every model ordinance are intentionally, knowingly, and negligently. These must be defined to provide clarity and support the language in the ordinance. And you'll often find as you look at other ordinances of communities, you'll actually see those spelled out. So it's very concise and it's very clear. We haven't talked much about it at this point, but also definitions to come up with are safe harbor provisions. What will you include in your local ordinance in terms of safe harbor? Safe harbor, sometimes referred to as amnesty, protects individuals from criminal liability if a party host requests assistance from police, and they can do this when they want someone removed who refuses to abide by the party host's demand to stop drinking. It could be they call someone in to terminate the gathering because the party host has been unable to prevent underage persons from consuming alcohol, despite even reasonable steps to do so. And they can call police in to help before any other person makes a formal complaint to law enforcement. So crafting ordinance language takes time, but including those agreed upon terms can help save time on the back end and really help the ordinance be clear, concise, and most importantly, enforceable. Note that this example I gave you for safe harbor comes from the Illinois Social Host Law, and that the person making the complaint really does have to request help and assistance before anyone else. It can't be a situation where the police arrive and the host says, "Oh, thank you, I was just getting ready to call you." At that point, it's just simply too late. And before I tell you a little about some resources we have at the Alcohol Policy Resource Center, I do want to mention that although our focus today has been on alcohol, social host ordinances can be expanded to include cannabis or other controlled substances. And this can be a really powerful tool for communities. Accountability can be expanded to include substances that youth may use, and this expansion is often a tool that's beneficial to law enforcement who will have the flexibility to deal with whatever substances they may be dealing with under one simple ordinance. If a community already has a social host ordinance, typically adding this additional language, it can be done with fairly little production. You're not starting from scratch, you're just fine-tuning and adding just a little bit of language in there that's going to help strengthen. The additional benefit of using language such as other controlled language, which sometimes seems vague. It's like, well, other controlled substances. It's okay to have that language be vague because if a new version of a drug comes out, the ordinance won't have to be continuously updated, and it will automatically stay in step with the current written law. Just something to think about. We're in a place in Illinois right now where we really want to include cannabis in social host because it is now, recreationally legal, but that doesn't change for our young people, and making sure that parents and community adults aren't taking steps to really open that up and allow for not only drinking, but smoking and use of other substances. And we know this is a really solid tool, policy work, that we can implement that can help keep youth safe and healthy. All right, so a little bit about the Alcohol Policy Resource Center. We are out of Illinois. You can get to us by visiting www.prevention.org. You'll see that it'll take you to the Prevention First website, and up top you'll see that there's a tab you can click, and it'll show you the Alcohol Policy Resource Center. And once you click on that, you'll have all kinds of options of what you can look at to help you in your policy efforts. So we work to create fact sheets, and we work to create those based on policies and law enforcement strategies. So a few of the fact sheets that we have are alcohol advertising restrictions, how to conduct environmental scans, information on outlet density, alcohol taxes, event restrictions, responsible beverage service, keg registration, minor in possession ordinances, and of course, fact sheets on social host. We have law enforcement strategy information on how you complete alcohol compliance checks, tops and shops, shoulder tap, sobriety checkpoint, and soon we'll be adding resources on controlled party dispersal and place of last drink, so POLD. We also house our webinars, and we tape all of those and we put those on a go-to stage so that you can at any time go see what we've got recorded and learn about how you work with law enforcement on policy, We've got some on controlled party dispersal, on why alcohol regulation actually exists. There's a lot of information that can be confusing, so that can be helpful to just have a little bit of information to help you. As I look at this fast fact sheet we have on Social Host, one thing I want to point out to you is included in here is a little bit of information on, in Illinois, some municipalities and what their ordinance language includes. And again, I think it's so important to really take the time to look at as much language as you can to help you know what it is you want and what it is you need for your community. And you would think that you'd start to see some similarities, and you do, but it's often interesting to me to see how differently communities set up that ordinance language. And some will focus much more heavily on defining terms. Some will focus much more heavily on what those fines and those consequences will be. But the more that you can really look at ordinance language, again, I've said this over and over, the more you're really going to know what you want and what will work with your community. So hopefully these are some resources that can help you build your social host capacity. Feel free to reach out as you need help. But I'm going to turn it back over to Chuck for more resources, and I thank you for your time.
All right. Thank you so much, Kellie, again, for your expertise and experience. I think Kellie has given us lots to think about and a place to start. As you heard early on in the beginning of her talk about this issue, the importance of doing homework right on the front end, and know that in addition to Prevention First and the Alcohol Policy Resource Center there, which I think is a fantastic place to start, as you begin to think about what's in your own state, I want to highlight a couple of more resources. So if you're in Minnesota, you can go to the MPRC and again find their website, mprc.org. You're going to be able to see, sort of looking at county by county what exists. You can go deeper and look at individual county level language. You can also get some support and technical assistance and find a whole host of other kinds of really helpful resources similar to the ones that Kellie talked about in Minnesota. We also mentioned on the last call and throughout this series the richness we have here in the Midwest with regard to these kinds of resources. In addition to Illinois, there's also a center in Wisconsin at the University of Wisconsin-Madison Law School. There's a whole source with regard to alcohol policy project. In addition to that, they maintain a municipal inventory. So similar to the one that Kellie pointed out in Illinois, you can look up those issues and get some additional support for how to proceed with and look up language and find out what the law is in Wisconsin through that website at the Law School, University of Wisconsin-Madison Alcohol Policy Project. Long terminology. A few other examples, if you're in Indiana, the Coalition to Reduce Underage Drinking in Indiana provides a lot of great examples. I think they're a terrific example of how to disseminate best practices, how to track what's happening in the state, how to educate the community using this sort of virtual environment. There's, again, some resources about how to and what's going on with the law in Indiana. Another great place to shop for that in Ohio is the Prevention Action Alliance, which is, again, an organization that supports coalitions across the state and works in a number of ways and has a great variety of resources. So similarly, spend some time in Ohio looking at the Prevention Action Alliance resources around the same issue. Kellie mentioned early on an amazing source for looking up state-by-state information. And again, this is tracked in real time and updated regularly. So if I want to look at specifically my state, maybe you're not here in this region, or maybe you're in Michigan, we didn't give you a site, you can go to APIS and look specifically and enter your state. So not only can you see what the exact specific language is right now, you can see how it's changed over time. You can look at the policy, you can look at maps and charts. Finally, one more source that I think is valuable for folks as this issue is fast changing, Kellie mentioned, as it relates to other drugs. I think that we're looking at additional ways to track what's happening that are very current. The National Conference of State Legislatures website So in this case, ncsl.org. All you need to remember, ncsl.org is another place to look state by state for changes in statutes so that you can see what's happening with social host liability where you are. With that, I turn it back over to Ann. Thank you all for joining us today for part 2 of alcohol policy.
Thank you, both Chuck and Kelly, for some absolutely amazing information and very timely as we move into summer and hopefully all of us get out of our houses soon. We really do appreciate your time and expertise. We will be posting these webinars, both part 1 and part 2, on the Great Lakes current YouTube channel, as well as the Great Lakes Prevention Technology and Transfer Center websites. You will be given a brief period of time to submit questions. After that time has passed, all of those questions will be answered and those answers will be posted again on our website. If you have any specific questions about the Great Lakes Prevention Technology Transfer Center, these are the people that you can go to in each of your states, along with prevention managers Chuck Klevgaard and Aaron Ficker. Again, we appreciate your time. Thank you very much, both Chuck and Kelly, and we will end this webinar. If you have any other questions, you can feel free to contact anyone on the webinar. Thank you.